Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we are thrilled to be your hosts for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever need to grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate the Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Cheryl Jones. Cheryl Jones is a grief counselor, educator, and radio host. She developed and taught in a 3-year continuing education program as manager of professional education at the Women's Cancer Resource Center in Berkeley, California. Her weekly radio show, Good Grief, focuses on the transformations that sometimes come about after deep loss. Her interest in illness and grief originated in the 10-year period in which her first wife lived with cancer before her death in 1995. She recently published a novel, An Ocean Between Them. Though it is fiction, it is deeply informed by the experiences with cancer she's had in her own life and in the lives of her clients. Her perspective on resilience in hard times comes from her personal and professional experience supporting herself and her clients. It has also been richly enhanced by more than 300 interviews on her radio show about transformation after loss. Cheryl, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So Cheryl, I want to dive in. For about 10 years, you lived with helping your wife battle her cancer. Can you share your experience in that battle, the grief after her death, and the journey that led you to where you are today?
That's a big question, a big bunch of questions, but I can do that. So when she was diagnosed, she was given 6 months to a year to live. And at that time, the illness that she had was, now we're saying life-limiting, then they were saying terminal. She was never expected to live. She was never well. She just kept being alive. And it ended up being roughly 10 years from her first symptoms to her death, about 8.5 years from diagnosis to death. I always like to put out there that she was a Black woman, and it took 1.5 years to be diagnosed because she had back pain, and no one would test her back pain. And when they finally did an x-ray, just a simple x-ray, she had a broken back. So there was, that's so important to say right now, given that our context is Black Lives Matter, that health disparity is truly real. So I wanted to get that in there. So she lived for all those years, and we conducted an investigation of how to face her death. I would say that the first few years, and I never want to skip this part, were deeply anticipatory. It was a very difficult time for me. I had a lot of anxiety. I had a lot of fear, which is the bigger form of anxiety. It was not an easy time whatsoever. You can't skip that part. But what happened over time is that we figured out how to live with it. And life became quite intensely wonderful. Not the horrible symptomatic part, not dealing with cancer, not disability, because she had a very disabling cancer, but everything else improved over time. And by the time she died, all those years later, I was well in a way I hadn't been before as a person. Part of that was a function of time. I had a really long time to work on it. Part of it was a function of very good help and very good support. We were very blessed with the people around us. We spent a lot of time with Stephen and Andrea Levine, who helped us figure out how to live with what was coming up for us. So then she died. And I would say that her actual death, that moment, was pretty euphoric in the sense that it felt very transcendent. This is a short interview, so I won't go all the way into that, but and that lasted for a while afterwards, and then of course grief. And grief for me was quite doable because I had given up resistance to whatever was going on with me at the moment. And I had made a deal with myself before she died that I was going to let myself have whatever I could have to support me, including from myself. So if I needed to cry, I just cried. If I needed to, yell a little, I yelled. If I needed to sing, I sang. If I needed to dig in the dirt, I did that. And so grief was not horrible for me. It was just what it was. So I navigated that. All this time I was becoming a therapist. And so before she died, I got my licensure about halfway through her illness. And so I've always come to my work with clients from the point of view, this is really terrible. We're going to acknowledge that. We're going to sit with that together. And I can hold in the back of my mind that something profoundly transformative could come out of this.
Yeah.
That is a potential in every person's struggle, in every challenge. And so I've always called myself a grief counselor, regardless of what issue I'm working with. And I can only think of a couple times when people didn't, in fact, make something unexpected out of what they've gone through.
Yeah.
So then way fast forward, I wanted to kind of take that outside of my office, and over the course of time, my radio show emerged from that perspective because there are so many people that do that. I can kind of smell them now, if you will. If I run into some person doing something amazing, I can usually feel if they've had some big challenge experience that led there.
Well, it is interesting to me. You talk about counseling. How many people go to just counseling in general and don't associate it with grief until they get into counseling, and they don't associate that past grief that they've experienced as having something to do with what they're going through right now, or even just how much grief is part of all of the struggles that people have in their lives.
Absolutely. I guess I would say that I've never worked with anyone whose challenge didn't have loss in it.
Yeah.
Not necessarily death, but if loss is the difference between what we want it to be true and what is true, and that's how I like to think of it, nobody comes to therapy unless they're experiencing that.
Right.
Why would they?
Good point.
Right. I call it the developmental stage that no one talks about, and it has nothing to do with your age. You could be 5 or you could be 100, and I call it the developmental stage is ideals versus reality. And we all go through that, maybe even multiple times in our lives, where we somehow have to adapt to a reality that doesn't fit with what we wanted out of life. Yeah.
Well, and everyone in the world, almost everyone in the world is going through that right now, time of COVID, right? We've all lost the lives we had before.
Right.
And those of us who have learned to be elastic, to respond to, which is the definition of resilience I like, elasticity, we're doing okay.
Right.
My clients who've had big challenges that they have faced and figured out how to respond to seem to be doing better than people who haven't had to make that bargain with reality, if you will.
Well, and maybe in some ways, folks like that who have been through something very difficult actually have grown through that through that experience to where, they're, I don't want to say more prepared, but in a place to better receive change and things that happen. It reminds me of what Ted Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun's work on post-traumatic growth.
Absolutely.
That idea of growing through even the trauma. Yeah.
At some point, it's probably about 10 years ago now, a client came in and said, I ran across this amazing thing, post-traumatic growth. And I just, my ears went, ah!
Yeah.
So of course I immediately looked it up and I'm like, that's what I've been doing this whole time.
Right. Right. It's
And
even
I
part
didn't
of our
even
own
know
story.
it was being studied.
Right. I when I first read it, I thought, man, that's part of my story. Like I went through what I went through, and then I grew through it, and now this is what I do. Right. I mean, it's interesting how that.
Yeah, I've never met a person who would wish for the experiences that we've had that are painful and the losses we've had, but I wouldn't want to let go of the growth that came from it.
Right.
And go ahead, please.
Just that we get to claim the growth, and without it meaning we wished for the thing, we didn't have a choice.
Right.
It happened. And
Yeah.
so we have a choice. Do we make something out of it or not? That's the choice we have.
Meaning making. And also, we advocate moving forward with, as opposed to leaving behind.
Absolutely. It's been interesting in this time too, because some aspects of it have actually brought up the loss of my first wife. For instance, the last 4 months of her life, I didn't really leave the house, and I was having these pictures of that time in my head, and then I figured out, oh, it's reminding me of that. That's still a part of my memory bank. Good, bad, and indifferent. It became very present for me. So I think that can happen throughout life.
Yeah, it does. And again, that goes back to what we were talking about. Some people don't associate that feeling with their grief or their experience from a traumatic event, and need that navigation to make 2 and 2 equal 4 there.
Absolutely. And there's a relief in it when people make that connection. It's not a depressing event. And I think people who haven't had very profound loss, that's what makes it hard for them to support, is the idea that any mention of the loss or any catalyzing moment or tears or whatever it is will somehow make things worse. I've never found that to be true.
Yeah.
I've always found it comforting
Mm-hmm.
to have all of our experiences as humans included in the mix.
Not only that, it's almost like an affirmation. Oh, I'm not crazy. Now I understand. When you have that understanding, you're better able to cope with the experience.
Yes, and I know that you work with younger people. I've had many people come to therapy because they lost a parent young. But it isn't just the loss that brings them in, it's the way the loss was dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually the person died and then we weren't allowed to talk about it. Almost universally, that's what brings people to therapy later about that type of loss, is that no one contained it. No one said, of course you're upset. When you stop doing as well in school, maybe that has to do with the fact that you had such a big loss. All those things aren't supported, and so there's this kind of blank, fuzzy space where those conversations ought to be.
Yeah, so true. And we hear it so often from our young adults. So tell us about your book, An Ocean Between Them.
So I was going to write a nonfiction book, which was the logical thing for me to do. I'm not a fiction writer, or wasn't before I wrote that book. And I struggled with that nonfiction book for a couple of years. I could not, it just wasn't happening. And one day I thought, hey, maybe I could write it in a story. And then characters started populating my brain. I never knew this was a real thing that novelists talk about, where their characters start living in their brains, but it actually happened to me.
Yeah.
And the story that I chose to tell developed interestingly. As it's clear, I'm a lesbian. I came out at 18, just short of 18. So, and I'm 66 now. I'm not ashamed to say. So I have observed over the course of my life the loss of family. Fortunately, my family caught up, but I have watched the majority of people in my community lose their families. So the story that came to my mind is an estranged mother and daughter, and the daughter's diagnosed with cancer, and the mother goes through a radical descent into depression because she has so mishandled that relationship. And so the story is about their trying to reweave their relationship. And in the meantime, it's about living with cancer. And what that looks like in community, because that's my experience. So that none of the characters are me or anyone I know. They truly are fictional, but some of the experiences I've had or observed. So that's what it's about.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, Cheryl, we're actually a little bit short on time, but we typically are, those listening to the show want to know more about how they can connect with our guests. And so how could people go about connecting with you?
So I have a website, which is weatheringgrief.com, like weathering a storm, weatheringgrief.com. And there's a contact page where people can reach out to me. And for my show, the easiest way is just to put Voice America, all one word, comma, good grief, in your search bar, and my face should pop up. But of course, if you have trouble finding it, you can contact me on the website and I will link you up.
Wonderful. And is your book out? Is it currently out and available?
Out and available. You can order it on Amazon or any other, of the main bookstores. And if you like to read digitally, you can actually order it from the publisher, Sapphire Books.
Oh, wonderful. Great.
So Cheryl, we want to thank you for being a guest here on Let's Talk Death and for sharing your journey and the story behind your show, your work, and your book.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you to those joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of our programs and resources at Heal Grief, including our national network of support for young adults. It's a program that we call Actively Moving Forward.
Make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
And with that, again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Let's Talk Death.